In Englesia, one Underworld boss thinks a full potion can erase the blood on the floor. Mjollmile looks at the miracle cure, calls it cheap, and watches the whole room go silent. Then he sees the 3-snake badge on Gabbana's chest and realizes the man threatening him already works for him. AI Anime and Manga presents. If this part hits for you, tap like, comment your favorite reversal, and subscribe so the next slime chapter reaches more fans. YouTube members get early access to upcoming episodes as soon as they are ready, while helping cover the AI narration, subtitles, thumbnails, and rendering that keep the channel moving. Before the badge changes everything, Mjollmile's new life begins with money, railways, and the terrifying job of telling Tempest's monsters no. Gard Mjollmile had always admitted that luck had carried him farther than most merchants could dream. He had built a respectable business in Blumund, opened a branch in Englesia, and earned enough of a name that people in the Western nations knew him as more than a common shopkeeper. But after he accepted Rimuru's invitation, the word luck stopped feeling large enough. Rimuru was not simply his employer. Rimuru was king of the Jura Tempest Federation, a demon lord, a member of the Octagram, the friend of Milim, and the one who had Ludora, one of the 4 true dragons, casually living at his side. Mjollmile had once been saved from a sky dragon by that same smiling slime, and since then every new revelation about Rimuru had begun to numb him. Another impossible feat, another legendary friend, another creature who could level a kingdom wandering through town like a neighbor. At some point, the only sane response was, of course, that sounded like Sir Rimuru. Still, awe did not balance ledgers. Mjollmile's current role was Finance Minister of Tempest, even if his formal title shifted with the mood of the month. His work was no longer merchant accounting. It was deciding where a monster nation's vast funds should flow, which departments needed investment, and which terrifyingly powerful residents needed to be told that no, they could not have another casual budget increase today. The salary alone had nearly made him dance. 50 gold coins per month after taxes, with bonuses, stipends, housing support, and maids in training from Tempest Job Center helping with his home. His old Blumund staff were mostly government employees now, and his direct household expenses were modest enough that 20 gold coins covered Bydd, his guards, and the rest. Then came the part that made the salary look small. Mjollmile still earned from his old trading firm, and he was general manager for the fast food businesses born from Rimuru's festival ideas. Burgers, ramen, hibachi, highway inns, rest stop shops, Gobichi's endless new recipes, and a mysterious future treat called ice cream were all turning into real money. Rimuru's reasoning had been simple. Mjollmile made those ideas happen, so Mjollmile deserved his share. The contract was not written on paper, but Rimuru treated it as binding, and the profits arrived all the same. In under a year, Mjollmile had saved enough to live like a king for the rest of his natural life. The problem was that he no longer felt excited to calculate his yearly income. He felt frightened of the answer. And even that was not his strangest income stream. There was Ri-G. Ri-G meant Rimuru, Englesia, and Gard. It was the secret organization shared by Rimuru, the heavenly emperor Englesia of Thalion, and Mjollmile himself. Englesia was Big Mama, a divine figure to many and a drinking partner to Rimuru, which told Mjollmile far more than he wanted to know about the scale of company he was keeping. Somewhere along the way, the 3 of them had become the sort of adult beverage conspirators people might jokingly call the 3 pranksters. Somewhere along the way, Mjollmile had started calling the ruler of Thalion Big Mama. The details of how that happened were probably best left buried. Ri-G was the top secret among top secrets. In Tempest, only Benimaru and Soe were clued in by name. Soe supplied personnel and quiet support. Benimaru had been recruited through one of Rimuru's more suspicious domestic theories. Rimuru had brought it up as if it were normal advice. A man planning to marry, he argued, needed hidden spending money, something to keep away from the future wife just in case a night of drinking with friends required emergency funds.
I didn't have any plans.
Benimaru had tried to protest that he was already well compensated, but Rimuru would not be stopped. A man needed to be resourceful. He needed a stash, maybe even a year's official salary. Mjollmile had wisely said nothing. Rimuru already earned the same ministerial salary he did, and spending 600 gold coins a year on drinks would require a truly heroic thirst. Besides, Rimuru seemed far more afraid of Shuna discovering Rig than of any criminal organization in the West. That alone made silence the prudent choice. The serious design behind Rig was Rimuru's. Rig would be the underground organization, the one willing to get its hands dirty. Above it, two clean public firms would compete openly, preventing monopoly rot while still cooperating when the alliance needed them to. Big Mama would build the Western General Trade Company, or WGTC, out of former Razoside personnel in Doran. Mjollmile would build the Four Nations Trade Alliance for Tempest, Blumund, Farminus, and the Dwarven Kingdom. The Four Nations Trade Alliance was not gentle in its recruitment. Former hostile merchants were isolated, starved of customers, deprived of support, and then offered survival under Mjollmile's umbrella. Work for me and you keep a roof over your head. Not many refused. Bach, Mjollmile's former head clerk, joined after his debt was canceled and quickly became more valuable than expected. Blumund trained people. The Dwarven Kingdom sent ambitious bureaucrats blocked by long-lived superiors. Farminus needed more careful intervention, but that too was within the plan. It was ruthless, yes, but Mjollmile understood merchants. Pride mattered until profit entered the room. Once people realized the FNTA paid real salaries, promoted ability, and gave them a future after the newspapers had ruined their old standing, complaints began to fade. Some surely noticed the trap. Most had no better alternative. Over time, the very merchants who had once opposed Tempest were swearing loyalty to Mjollmile because he had turned their humiliation into employment. What Mjollmile lacked was trustworthy staff for rapid expansion across human nations. Rimuru's citizens were talented, but sending monster staff openly into human lands too soon risked prejudice, envy, and persecution. Rimuru understood that as well as Mjollmile did, so Rimuru called Testarossa. Testarossa was beautiful enough to make Mjollmile forget how speech worked, and dangerous enough that her soft smile could freeze the blood if one looked too closely. She offered her own underlings for the secret operation and promised that none would speak of it. The promise came with a low laugh that convinced Mjollmile the secret was safe. Then she turned that radiant smile on him and said she would instruct them to obey any order Sir Gard gave. Mjollmile thanked her far too loudly, and after that, the FNTA expanded at a frightening speed. Within months, the Alliance had small branches across council member nations. Then came another shock. Mjollmile was made director.
We are leaving everything to you. If Rimuru places his trust in you, Mjollmile, I certainly can as well.
King Gazel's support silenced any dwarven hesitation. Yom, King of Farminus, understood the feeling from a more personal angle.
We're the ones being helped here, and I got no complaints about that so far. So hang in there, okay?
Then Yom leaned closer and whispered that it could not be easy being wrapped around Rimuru's finger.
Not for either of us. But thanks to that, I couldn't possibly be having more fun.
Yom smiled back. He understood. Blumund was more complicated. King Doram looked friendly, laughed freely, and never once let Mjollmile forget that the whole kingdom was gambling on Rimuru's plans. Doram had stopped ordinary agriculture, released national food stores, and set the people to training for the coming World Central Station and Magitrain era. Blumund had about a year of food. After that, the country's future depended on employment through the FNTA and the logistics network. Doram asked for support as if the answer were obvious. Rimuru was building the World Central Station in Blumund's lands. Surely Rimuru would not abandon them after that. Mjollmile wanted to shout that this was insane. Instead, he saw the truth. If Blumund's gamble failed, Rimuru's plan failed too. And if the whole population was willing to work, the FNTA's staffing problem could become its greatest opportunity. So Mjollmile promised to bring Blumund to full employment. Doram's ministers did not protest. That made the moment feel even heavier. They were not watching a king improvise. They were watching the final piece of a decision they had already accepted. Blumund had released food, redirected labor, and begun training citizens because it believed Rimuru's rail network would arrive before the reserve ran dry. If the FNTA hesitated, a nation would pay for that hesitation in empty storehouses. Dorum then tried to deepen the relationship by asking Mjollmile to drop the royal distance and call him Dorum. When that nearly made Mjollmile faint from etiquette panic, the king pushed even further and suggested Dori. Mjollmile fought his way back to the much safer Sir Dorum, while the ministers behind the king smiled in relief. They were all serious. Blumund was tying itself to Mjollmile, to the FNTA, and to Rimuru's future economy. Afterward, Viscount Veryard briefed Mjollmile on the details. Blumund's agents were gathering price information in other countries. Its citizens were studying world affairs, economics, and bureaucracy under the banner of wise people, bountiful country. The more talented students were already being sent into practical work. The smile on Veryard's face never moved, even as he described a national transformation bold enough to make most rulers tremble. Mjollmile responded with the Magitrain plan. Tracks were advancing from Dwargen through Farminus toward Blumund. Farminus would send crops and produce to Dwargen. Dwargen would send industrial goods back along the line, and Blumund would become the place where goods were stored, sorted, cleaned, allocated, warehoused, and sent onward through highways and future rail routes. Later lines would reach Thalion and Englesia. If this worked, Blumund would become a trade hub powerful enough to reshape the Western nations. The land negotiation revealed how prepared Blumund truly was. The kingdom had nationalized land ownership under the king, then offered leases. Prime areas around World Central Station and the logistics hub were ready, but Mjollmile immediately saw the danger. If Blumund controlled the land, future rent pressure could turn an infrastructure project into a national crisis. Big Mama had taught him to think through every possibility, and he could already imagine her asking why he had let the term shift under his feet. Veryard's villainous smile widened. Blumund was willing to make permanent lease agreements and treat the best sites as extraterritorial areas. The condition was that the FNTA hire Blumund citizens and place its headquarters in Blumund. It was a brilliant move. Blumund would gain jobs, investment, prestige, and perhaps even the nerve center of the world economy. Mjollmile accepted. The more he thought about it, the more impressive Dorum's gamble looked. If embassies, warehouses, headquarters, and railside businesses gathered around World Central Station, land values would rise for reasons no tourist slump could easily erase. Blumund would not merely move goods, it would host the people who decided where goods moved next. The kingdom had no intention of remaining a small, sensible country tucked between larger powers. It meant to become indispensable. Once the treaty was done, he asked Veryard for his true feelings. Veryard stood by the window and announced that he would be talking to himself because nobles never revealed their real thoughts directly. In his little performance, he explained that he had been against the agreement in the past, and since the treaty was now signed, one could interpret that to mean he supported it in the present. The wording was careful, slippery, and very noble. Mjollmile laughed at himself. He had thought he knew how to bargain with nobles, but Veryard had reminded him that he still had far to climb. Veryard was not only protecting his king, he was protecting himself. Blumund's wise people, bountiful country policy would bring prosperity, but prosperity could weaken the old nobility's grip. The country had few nobles to begin with, and if education and bureaucracy expanded far enough, many titles might become ceremonial. Veryard did not mourn that future. He saw it coming and preferred to profit before he was left behind. Then Mjollmile took the risk.
I apologize if this is too forward of me, but I hope you will hear me out. Do you have any interest in working for me?
Veryard did not treat it as a joke. He admitted that he had been considering a change of employer. Blumund's reforms would make the nobility more ceremonial over time, and Veryard cared more about profit than title. He had been auditioning, not merely negotiating. Mjollmile saw through him, and Veryard smiled. He would work for Mjollmile strictly as an advisor for now. That was enough. Mjollmile wanted his experience, his political sense, and his ability to navigate Englesia, where the FNTA would soon face the land's most powerful merchants. They shook hands. With Veryard's support, the alliance grew steadier. Before long, the real test arrived in Englesia. Mjollmile traveled with Bydd and Gabbana. Bydd had trained in Tempest and risen from D+ to B rank, with new gear and enough trust to accompany Mjollmile on extended business trips. Gobbimon was the true deterrent. He had become an ogre mage, which sounded absurd until one remembered that Tempest was full of absurd people. His horns were small enough to hide under a hat or bandana, and in a sharp business suit he could pass at first glance as a hobgoblin attendant. The meeting was being held at a grand hotel. Mjollmile, Bydd, and Gobbimon dressed for business because the room ahead was a battlefield of another kind. It would be full of top merchants, old Western power brokers, and crime lords who had smelled opportunity after the Razzo family's decline. At the entrance, the hotel staff checked Mjollmile's identity, accepted Bydd's letter of introduction, and searched them for weapons. Then FNTA employees guided them into a large chamber fit for noble balls. The room was already watching. The gossip started before Mjollmile had even settled in. Was that the head of the FNTA? The cruel merchant who had swallowed smaller businesses? The upstart who got his post by currying favor with Demon Lord Rimuru? Others warned that Tempest could not be dismissed, not with its military power and Testarosa's growing influence over the council. They mentioned Doran, the Five Elders, Prince Johann of Rostia, Margrave Sidra, and every other name tied to the Old Order's collapse. Nobody tried to hide the discussion. They wanted Mjollmile to hear it. They wanted to see whether he had the nerve to stand in a room of people who normally never gathered unless fortunes were changing hands. That was what made the meeting dangerous. These were not ordinary shop owners hoping for favorable terms. They were people who controlled trade routes, credit, information, hired muscle, and the little acts of obstruction that could smother a new organization before it learned to breathe. Some were lawful enough to attend in fine clothes. Others ruled the alleys and gambling dens from behind polished smiles. Razzo's decline had not frightened them. It had opened a throne, and every one of them was measuring the distance to it. Then Alecchio addressed him. Alecchio was Don Gabbana's bodyguard, a retired A-ranked adventurer built like a wall and dressed in full-body leather armor that broke the entire mood of the business meeting. No one mocked the outfit. Alecchio's reputation for violence was too well known. When Mjollmile was younger, Alecchio had pestered him for food, money, and whatever else he felt like taking. Behind him stood Don Gabbana, an underworld titan so powerful the Englesian authorities had once looked away from Alecchio's crimes. Mjollmile smiled because panic would ruin him.
Well, if it isn't Alecchio, what a surprise to see you in a place like this.
Alecchio's reply was low and threatening. Who had given Mjollmile permission to speak to him that way? The old fear went straight through Mjollmile's stomach. People called him the Emperor of the Underground in Blumund, but compared with the real Western underworld, he still felt like a man too far from shore. Bydd tried to intervene, trembling but brave. Alecchio turned on him at once. A small-time bodyguard speaking out of turn was an insult Alecchio could not tolerate. Mjollmile could not buy his way out. Not here. Not in front of this room. If he yielded, every merchant present would decide that the FNTA's director could not handle a single thug. So he steadied his voice and told Alecchio that he was now director of the Four Nations Trade Alliance. Since they had known each other a long time, he would overlook the insult if Alecchio promptly left his sight. The air changed. Bydd called his name, knees shaking. Alecchio asked whether Mjollmile thought he would not lay hands on him with all these witnesses present. Mjollmile thought no sane man would start violence at a formal meeting, especially when it would embarrass Don Gabbana. Then Alecchio moved. Gobbimon acted before Mjollmile understood what was happening. He threw Bydd out of the line of danger and stepped in front of Mjollmile himself. Alecchio's blow struck Gobbimon, but the force tore Bydd's ear away. It had happened so fast that the room seemed to understand it in pieces. Mjollmile saw Bydd on the floor. He saw blood. He saw Gobbimon standing where death should have landed. He saw Alecchio still wearing that mocking confidence, as if a business conference were a street corner and anyone weaker than him existed only to be shoved aside. Mjollmile rushed to Bydd.
You all right, Bydd?
Bydd apologized for being unable to help. Mjollmile told him not to worry. If Bydd died over something like this, Rimuru would be enraged, and Mjollmile would be just as mad. Beside them, Gobbimon's anger sharpened. He asked Alecchio whether he had meant to kill Bydd. Alecchio laughed it off as an accident. A love tap made worse because Gobomon interfered. Gobomon's answer was cold. Bydd might be inexperienced, but he was his brother in arms and Alecchio had gone too far. The room might have become a battlefield then, but Don Gabbana entered as if on cue. Gabbana asked what Alecchio was doing, and Alecchio played innocent. Gabbana then noticed Bydd's injury and provided a potion, staging himself as the generous elder who calmed the dust after his own man had kicked it up. Alecchio sprinkled the potion over Bydd. The torn ear healed at once. The gallery gasped. A full potion used on someone they considered lowborn. A treasure worth a fortune spent as if it were nothing. Mjollmile and Bydd stared at each other in a different kind of shock. In Tempest, Bydd trained with Gobimon often enough that lost limbs were an occupational hazard, and full potions had become survival supplies. Only now, hearing the room react, did Mjollmile remember how impossible that looked to ordinary people. Then the crowd noticed Gabbana's badge. On Gabbana's breast gleamed a Magisteel seal with 3 intertwined snakes. Mjollmile knew that badge. How could he not? He, Rimuru, and Big Mama had spent 3 days arguing over the design. Rimuru had suggested snakes for knowledge, greed, and eternity. Big Mama had added drunkenness, which apparently suited them. Mjollmile had laughed and proposed 3 snakes tangled together like the 3 of them after too many refills. That was the Re-G seal. The fear vanished so quickly Mjollmile nearly felt foolish. Don Gabbana's group had been absorbed into Reg. The old monster in front of him was not a doom descending from above. He was a subordinate who did not know he had just insulted one of his own bosses. This was no longer a threat. It was a stage.
You, I believe, are president of the Gabbana Merchant Group, right? How do you intend to atone for this incident?
Gabbana blinked. Alecchio bristled. The audience buzzed as the man from the FNTA openly defied a face of Reg-G. Mjollmile let the attention gather, then shouted for quiet with a voice that did not shake. The confidence felt strange, but it was real. He dealt with Veldora nearly every day. He had rejected allowance increases from beings who could turn cities to dust. Calamity-class Magicborn left his office sheepish after being scolded over budget requests. Testarossa smiled at him in the halls, and one of his office slogans existed for the very practical reason that sexual harassment is a crime. Compared with that daily life, Gabbana and Alecchio were suddenly much smaller. That was the absurd gift Rimuru had given him. Mjollmile had not become a warrior. He could not survive a punch from Alecchio, much less a casual aura flare from Veldora. But his sense of scale had changed. He knew what true monsters looked like when they were asking for money. He knew what it felt like to say no to people who could make a fortress disappear and somehow keep his job afterward. Gabbana had terror, history, and influence. Tempest had made Mjollmile familiar with things beyond terror. Bydd sensed it too and backed him up, telling the room that Mjollmile was not someone they could talk down to. So Mjollmile grandstanded.
Perhaps I should have given you the discipline you needed from the start. And?
Bydd, still stinging from the injury and insult, suggested they begin with an apology. Mjollmile accepted the cue.
Alecchio, Gabbana, if you apologize right now, I will pretend none of this happened. But if you insist on stirring the pot with me by my name as Gard Mjollmile, Finance Minister of the Jura Tempest Federation and Director of the Four Nations Trade Alliance, I promise you that I'm not afraid to fight. So what will it be?
Gabbana understood enough to bow. He tried to excuse Alecchio as overexcited and pointed out that he had provided a potion. Mjollmile laughed loudly enough for the room.
And you think that cheap drug can smooth all this over? That tells me all I need to know about you.
It was a performance, but it was also true. Rimuru made sure Mjollmile carried several full potions as a matter of habit. To the merchants, the line sounded like impossible arrogance. To Tempest, it was inventory management. Mjollmile declared that if this was all Gabbana had to offer, he lacked the talent to join the grand project Mjollmile had come to propose. Then he ordered Gabbana out of the chamber. Gabbana warned him softly not to regret it, then left with Alecchio. For one frozen moment, the hall was silent. Then it erupted. Some cheered, some calculated, and almost everyone revised their opinion of the FNTA director. Mjollmile seized the momentum. He presented Blumund as a future logistics hub, World Central Station as the nexus of a new trade network, and the FNTA as the organization positioned to benefit from the post-Razo era. The merchants were interested but cautious. After all, he had just picked a fight with Reg. They expected a hitman to remove him soon enough. That suited him. If he survived, trust in him would rise. And since he was the G in Reg, survival was not in doubt. He did not need them to sign everything immediately. He needed them to watch. He needed them to wonder whether the FNTA could really stand against the shadow organization swallowing the Western Underworld. Every suspicious glance became useful. Every whisper about his coming assassination made tomorrow's survival worth more. Mjollmile had come to sell a logistics project, but Gabbana had accidentally given him a better product, proof of authority. The next morning, a black carriage waited outside the hotel. Alecchio told Mjollmile, Bydd and Blumund to get in. He tried to sound like he was carrying them to their doom. Mjollmile climbed inside with a smile. After 20 minutes, the carriage stopped in an affluent district, exactly where he expected. It was the Englesia headquarters of the Sons of the Belt, renovated into a reg site with his own help. Alecchio boasted that people more fearsome than Mjollmile could imagine were waiting below. Mjollmile almost pitied him. At the entrance, Alecchio received the first sign that something was wrong. High leadership had gathered. Not the 7 blades, higher. The 3 bosses, perhaps. Even Alecchio's confidence began to crack. They descended into the basement. The space had once held an altar, but Rigi had remade it into an underground audience chamber. Rimuru had wanted atmosphere for a shadowy secret cabal, so no detail had been spared. As Tempest's budget overseer, Mjollmile would normally object to waste. As Rigi, he had to admit that filthy lucre could buy a very fine secret lair. 3 floors down, Vegan of the 7 Blades guarded the inner door. Alecchio recognized him and stammered. Vegan called him an idiot, refused entry to the extra servants, and allowed only Alecchio and the guests inside. The door closed behind them, magically sealed so that no sound could leak out. Candles filled the vast chamber with dancing light. Nearly 100 leaders waited below. Some were known to Mjollmile, many were not. Alecchio tried to stop him from walking forward, but Vegan kicked his hand away before Bydd or Blumund needed to move. The leaders who knew Mjollmile immediately took a knee. The others saw that and followed. Alecchio's world rearranged itself in front of him. The hierarchy he trusted, the titles he feared, the violent names he had treated as above ordinary men, all bent toward the merchant he had mocked yesterday. Mjollmile did not need to shout. The kneeling did the shouting for him. Don Gabbana's voice echoed through the chamber as he realized the truth. Sir Mjollmile was one of the bosses. Glenda Atlee, dressed to command attention and serving as Rigi's visible proxy boss, confirmed it for everyone. The man Gabbana had been begging Rigi to kill was one of Rigi's own head honchos. Gabbana nearly collapsed. Once he had been a godlike figure in Mjollmile's world. Now he could barely stand. Mjollmile praised Glenda for the project's success and the previous day's conference. Glenda immediately asked that her merit points be considered. Mjollmile promised double the usual, which made her smile. Then she guided him up to the platform with 3 boss seats. He sat in one. No one objected. That was how much the room feared Glenda. Gabbana and Alecchio were restrained before him, and the Underworld leaders began proposing punishments. Death was the mild option. Some wanted torture first. Others suggested sacrifices, bodies, and examples for anyone else who forgot loyalty. Gabbana lost his color. Alecchio looked for some impossible path of resistance and found none. Alone, he might have killed Mjollmile. In this room, surrounded by leaders and fighters with Glenda present, he had no chance. Mjollmile considered the pair. They had made serious mistakes, but he did not think execution was right. Gabbana had not known Mjollmile was a boss. Alecchio had injured Bydd, which still angered him, but the injury had no lasting consequence. Rimuru knew about the conference, and Soe's people had been in the room as well. If things had truly gone beyond control, someone would have intervened. More than that, Mjollmile did not want Regi's first lesson under his visible command to be mindless slaughter. Anyone could rule frightened people by killing the first fool who made a mistake. That was not reform. That that was only the old Underworld wearing a new badge. If Regi was going to absorb the darkness of the Western nations, it needed rules strong enough to change the people inside it. Mjollmile called for order.
They will not be punished. Gabbana is no traitor to our organization. He simply did not know I was the boss. If he betrays our trust again, that is a different matter, but I am going to overlook this event.
The chamber stirred in protest. A young man stepped forward, arguing that leniency would make Reg look weak. In the Underworld, face mattered. Let one man make a fool of the boss, and others would start sharpening knives. Veryard of the Sons of the Belt quietly identified the challenger as Yang of the Black Nails, a stern and talented fighter roughly equivalent to A rank. Mjollmile saw the danger immediately. If Reach became a place where power alone decided authority, every decision would become a seed for future coups. That was not what he wanted Reach to be. So he turned the question around.
Who is screwing with me?
Yang hesitated.
I am asking you who could beat me, Yang. Do you think you could?
Yang's eyes flicked toward Glenda. That told Mjollmile plenty. Glenda had defeated the Black Nails, and now Yang was measuring authority through strength he had already lost to. Mjollmile pressed harder. If saving face was so important, should Yang not take responsibility for addressing his boss with contempt? Then he turned to Glenda and took back the double merit points. She complained, but he silenced her. Yang was not the only one failing to treat the boss with respect. The room had no right to criticize Gabbana while committing the same mistake. Then Mjollmile understood. Gabbana and Alecchio were being used. Glenda had planted the idea that someone should challenge him. She admitted it cheerfully and then made it worse by revealing that Lady Englesia had authorized the test and told her to hide it from him. Big Mama's mean streak had struck again. Mjollmile was annoyed, but the room still needed the lesson. He warned Yang and everyone else that they could think about overthrowing him if they liked, but they had better understand the consequences.
I might be too weak to survive any attempts on my life, but let me make this clear. If I go, all of Re goes.
That was not a bluff. Yang understood it. Sweat spread through the chamber as Veryard and Glenda reminded everyone that prying into the other bosses could get a person killed. When Mjollmile asked whether anyone objected to his ruling, every voice answered no. Yang was spared with a warning, and Mjollmile accepted his promise to work harder. Then, with the top management gathered, he established Regi's core rules.
First, do not betray your friends. Second, be gracious enough to forgive the mistakes of others. Third, do not punch down or bring misfortune upon anyone.
The first rule was obvious, and betrayal would mean death. The second mattered because Regi was a last resort for people who had fallen low. Not everyone they absorbed would be refined or easy to manage, and reform required patience from the top. The third was the most important. Regi was absorbing the great forces of organized crime. But if the members kept devouring each other and preying downward, they would never become useful competition for the public merchants. Mjollmile wanted them to wield their new influence with pride. They were not a clean organization. They would never whitewash everything. But Rimuru's wish, and Mjollmile's, was for a chivalrous underworld, one that helped the weak, crushed the powerful when necessary, and did not spread misery simply because it could. That did not make Regi virtuous in the simple, public sense. Its work would still include pressure, surveillance, threats, and bargains decent people preferred not to see. But there was a difference between power used to keep order and power used to amuse the strong at the expense of the weak. Mjollmile wanted every leader in that chamber to know which side of that line Regi would stand on. It was power silencing people who believed in power. For this room, that was the right language. Afterward, the Gabbana family was dismantled and its members reassigned. Gabbana himself became Mjollmile's personal advisor under a different identity at the Blumund headquarters. He was too talented to waste, especially when the Magitrain project had become a constant thorn in Mjollmile's side. That project was Rimuru's fault, naturally. Rimuru came up with wild ideas and then handed them over by cheerfully saying, "It's all yours, Molly." Mjollmile loved the work and hated how much of it existed. He was an average human being with 2 hands and a need for sleep. When he shut down a project for budget reasons, it was often his own health he was trying to protect. Gabbana quickly learned the truth. Every day he complained that he was grateful for the second chance but appalled by the mountain of work waiting for him. Mjollmile wished he would complain to Rimuru instead, but he did feel guilty enough to pay the man well. Alecchio was given to Gabbana. The ogre mage had requested the right to settle matters after Bydd's injury, so a fight was arranged with a promise of future upper management if Alecchio showed the right spirit. Gabbana dominated him. Then Gabbana taught him the lesson behind the beating. There was always someone stronger. Even Gabbana was only above average in his homeland. Strength was not something to show off. It belonged hidden in the heart, to be used for just causes and to protect what must never be lost. Alecchio listened. The bruises helped. Before long, he volunteered to serve beside Gabbana. Publicly, the ending looked very different. Raggy and the FNTA needed a flashy debut, but they also needed to preserve the illusion that they were separate powers. So the newly purchased FNTA mansion in Englesia was evacuated, then blown to cinders. The resulting gossip did exactly what it needed to do. Diablo's journalists wrote beautiful coverage, making Raggy look fearsome and ominous while painting Mjollmile as a man who could not be intimidated. The breakup of the Gabbana family became headline news. Rumors spread that Rigi and the FNTA had declared a truce to rest and regroup, and the public accepted the story. The destruction also gave hesitant merchants a story they could understand. The FNTA had been attacked, yet its director remained standing. Rigi had shown its teeth, yet it had not swallowed him. Gabbana's family had fallen, yet the new economic project continued. To anyone outside the secret, it looked like two dangerous forces had tested each other, found the cost too high, and stepped back. That lie protected both sides. That was how the FNTA reached the starting line. Then the branch earnings arrived, and even Mjollmile was speechless. Some locations were earning dozens of gold coins per hour. A single day could exceed his yearly ministerial salary. In the eyes of ordinary people, he was making more in an hour than many could make in a year. Benimaru and Soe were paid for helping Reg. Soe's direct agents earned much more, with expenses covered. Glenda and Veryard received enough to maintain the lavish lifestyles expected of people posing as bosses. Big Mama, Rimuru, and Mjollmile each received government-linked compensation from the profits as well. Mjollmile's account grew at a pace that felt unreal even to a man who had already called himself lucky. But he was not satisfied. Mjollmile was wealthy, frightened, overworked, and surrounded by people who made impossible things sound like routine errands. He knew his destiny had changed because he met Rimuru. That did not make him want to rest. It made him want to climb higher. Gard Mjollmile intended to run as hard as he could for as long as he lived, so that when death finally came for him, he would have no regret.
Route confirmed. The next episode and full playlist are ready.
Then don't stop here. Keep watching in story order and subscribe before the next part drops.